The Court of Appeal has delivered a landmark ruling on a constitutional challenge arising from the government's 2020 COVID-19 border closure policy. The judgment in the case of Lorick and Pantin versus the Attorney General centered on the state's administration of the travel exemption system for nationals stranded abroad. The court unanimously ruled against the state, finding that the Minister of National Security's failure to publicly disclose the criteria for granting exemptions was unconstitutional. Former Attorney General Anand Ramlogan SC joins us via telephone this evening to tell us more about this historic and landmark judgment. Good evening, Mr. Ramlogan.
Good evening.
All right, so we want to get right into it. The court has called this historic and a landmark judgment. Can you elaborate a little bit for us as to what specific legal precedent this sets for constitutional rights, especially as it relates to liberty and freedom of movement in Trinidad and Tobago?
Yeah, well, the genesis of this matter, you may recall, is when during the COVID-19 pandemic, we had closed our borders on a very sudden basis. And whilst that decision would have been understandable at the time, when the decision was made to reopen the borders, the government did not publish any criteria to guide persons who were stranded overseas and desperate to return home as to how they will decide who is going to come home and when. So that meant that there was a secret criteria. The factors that the then Minister Stuart Young was taking into consideration was something that only he alone knew. And we had filed cases for Ms. Joanne Pantin and Rihanna Lorick. One was seeking medical attention abroad at the time, and Ms. Lorick was visiting her grandchildren. And of course, when the borders were closed, with limited funds that you would have budgeted to spend a limited time on a trip overseas, money ran out. And so many hundreds of our citizens were stranded, and Trinidad's government turned its back on them because they were rendered homeless, living in homeless shelters in parks. And when the borders were reopened and they felt they would get some relief to come home, they were not told what was the criteria and what really was the factors that the minister would consider. No one can forget Ms. Joanne Pantin's video to then Prime Minister Keith Rowley, her distressed, traumatized face begging and pleading to be allowed to come back home and questioning, well, how is it others are being allowed to come back home and I am not? The fact of the matter is, those who were rich, powerful, had strong political connections, financiers, friends of the ruling party, they were secretly being allowed to return to Trinidad, whilst persons who couldn't afford to remain outside were being kept there in the dark, not knowing how, when, why, and if they will ever be able to return home. This is an indictment on the government's management of the reopening of the borders. It was the court described it as the epitome of arbitrariness. And what it did is to provide fertile soil by this mystery and secrecy. It provided fertile soil for political bias and discrimination to operate, so that what you had, the population must remember, there are many mothers and fathers who died overseas because they grieved to return home, but many also died because they were heartbroken at the lack of compassion shown to them by the government, because they were seeing people who were rich and famous, who could have afforded to remain outside. They were seeing that they were coming back on private yachts down the islands. They were seeing that they were being snuck into the country, and yet still these poor people were left out there to die. So it is a stain and a blot on the collective social and political conscience of our country, and those who are responsible for this travesty of justice. Minister Stuart Young, the then Prime Minister Keith Rowley, the Minister of Health Terence Dalsing, and Dr. Roshan Parasam, Chief Medical Officer, they all together collectively managed this. And today the court has ruled that they violated and breached the citizens' rights, constitutional rights, by having a secret policy that they alone knew how they were managing and what factors they were taking into account. It is a sad day for Trinidad and Tobago, quite frankly.
So, Mr. Ramlogan, if I can interject there, you're talking about Stuart Young's actions, which you described as playing God in your statement. Do you believe now that there should be some form of legal accountability and beyond compensation? What kind of recourse should there be now? Is there like a public inquiry that should take place or a criminal investigation, for example, that should take place?
I think the time has come for us to do some form of inquiry into the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of money was spent by taxpayers, and nobody knows where it went and whose pockets it landed up. Things like this, the management of the reopening of the country's borders, illustrates why we need to have some form of investigation and inquiry, because at the end of the day, to be blunt about it, everybody in the country knows the 1% was allowed to come back into the country quite comfortably without any problems. But there were mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, people with little children, the elderly and sick, who were left there to die like dogs. The government turned its back on them, reopened the border and controlled it like a floodgate, where they would allow some who they handpicked to come in, and others they just allowed them to just make applications. As the Court of Appeal said in its judgment, the people were literally shooting in the dark, not knowing what to say in their applications and what was the criteria that was being applied by the minister to allow people to come back in. So it really was a tragedy of epic proportions. People have worked their whole lives hard to build a little house, have their home here in Trinidad, went on a vacation, and this thing felt like a guillotine. And then you were just shut out from your home country, and you were rendered destitute and homeless.
Mr. Ramlogan, I want to ask you there, because you are making reference to Joanne Pantin and, of course, Lorick, who are now symbolic figures in this case after the judgment. What does this ruling mean for citizens of Trinidad and Tobago who may have suffered a similar situation during that border closure? Can we expect a wave of lawsuits coming out of this?
The short answer is persons who are similarly circumstanced, who were left stranded, grieving and crying to come back home, whilst others were merrily making their way back in the country by some mysterious, secretive process known only to the Minister Young and his cohorts. Those persons will have now a very solid claim for the breach of their constitutional rights, because their right to liberty, due process, and protection of the law has now been ruled by the Court of Appeal to have been infringed by this secretive operation that was carried out by the government, whereby some were allowed back in, whilst others were simply left in the dark and in the cold.
Mr. Ramlogan, and
so,
before we leave this evening, we are a bit pressed for time, but I want to find out from you, what changes would you recommend to ensure that this kind of systemic failure does not occur in a future crisis?
It's very simple. The buzzwords are transparency, accountability, and good governance. There was simply no transparency in how the government was allowing people to return after the borders were reopened. They did it in a secretive manner. People were coming. Some people were being let in the dead of night. Others were just, left out there in the cold. But there was no transparency, and there was no public accountability by the government on the issue of how they were managing the repatriation of our citizens. And as I said, even now, people have not even had emotional and psychological closure, because they lost loved ones and they were allowed to die. Nobody knows what it's like to know that a parent was left to die in a foreign country with no money, destitute and homeless, while you were helplessly writing letters to a government that turned a blind eye and deaf ear to the plight of your friends and family and loved ones. But it is a stain and a blot on the nation's conscience, and it is an indelible mark that must go down in history as one of the worst forms of inhumanity and cruelty to our own citizens.
Democracy calling for more accountability, transparency, and good governance. The words coming from former Attorney General, as you just heard, Anand Ramlogan SC, giving his insights on the Court of Appeal ruling in the Lorick and Pantin versus the Attorney General case. Thank you so much for joining us, Anand Ramlogan, this evening.